Welcome to this bonus episode of the Filmumentaries Podcast. I'm Jamie Benning, your host and the creator of this show. This time I'm joined once again by author and filmmaker John Walsh, whose latest book, The Art and Making of Gladiator 2, takes us inside Ridley Scott's long-awaited sequel. So John and I talk about how the book came together, what it was like working so closely with Paramount and Scott Free, and how he balanced the art, photography, and behind-the-scenes stories from such a massive production. So here's my conversation with John Walsh about his Gladiator 2 book, and I'll be back at the end for a tiny bit of jabbering on. John, it's great to have you back on the podcast. I mean, this collection of books of yours is growing bigger and bigger year on year, month on month, it seems. I mean, I think we first spoke about Escape from New York, and then Conan maybe. Now you've made this book about Gladiator 2, the art and the making of Gladiator 2. Have you now got to a point where studios are approaching you, or did you approach them? How did this book come about?
No, you guessed that right. Hi, Jamie. Great to be back on. Thank you. They approached me. So they said, we want someone to do this book. We think you're the guy. And I was like, really? Who's recommended me? It's a new publisher, Abrams. And I'd been recommended for it, partially by my previous commissioning editor at Tyson, Simon Ward, who's now at Ian Fleming Publications. And so he kind of spoke up for me. And it was a departure for me because, of course, it's a book about a new film, a film that hadn't been released, that wasn't finished when I started writing it. And, of course, all of the people are alive and there is thousands of images. So all the things I complained about before, oh, they're all dead and there's no decent photos. Now it was the opposite. There was more people than I could interview in the time I had, and thousands and thousands. I think it was like 30,000 images that I was privy to some of. But of course, it's all a very locked down process because I'm an external person. And although I signed an NDA for the script and images and so on, stuff had to be shared on a need to know basis. So it was very much how you'd imagine MI5 might operate with a newbie in the office. But it was great fun, very exciting.
Yeah, because as you said, like the books you've previously done are all about films where, you know, we've had decades potentially to think about them, and, you know, people have passed away and you've been lucky enough to get some of those people before they passed away. But this is a different tone entirely. How did you sort of approach that tone? Because you're doing a couple of jobs here. You're not only trying to tell the story this making of, but you're also trying to kind of publicize the film in some way as well. You have to sort of, did you find yourself having to fit in with a tone and a style that was sent to you by the studio?
No, not really. I think they'd looked at my previous books and thought, can you do something like that? And with previous films, if you take The Wicker Man as a good example, there were lots of unanswered questions over 50 years that were conflicting about, was it really cuts by Michael Dealey and Barry Spikings at British Line, or did Christopher Lee guess it wrong? Christopher Lee got it wrong. We were able to put to bed some of the myths. There are no myths around this film because it hadn't opened, and it was a switch in studio. So Paramount Pictures have Gladiator 2, and Universal Pictures, who were an entirely separate company, had the first film, Gladiator, back in 2000. I think one of the first things I did was to start to take a look at something they never asked me to look at, but was a chapter called The Road to Rome, where I kind of walked through all of the other scenarios the film could have been. And there are some right interesting variations on sort of time travel, on having Russell Crowe return as a ghost walking through different time periods. So all of that was kind of covered, but had to be verified with the folks there at Paramount. And of course, Ridley Scott is a producer on this picture, so he wasn't a gun for hire. So everything had to go through Abrams and Paramount and to Sir Ridley Scott's production company, Scott Free, and sort of back again. And there are different producers and different writers involved. So I think it was very important to get the architecture of the history correct because it was going into a book. And I think there was a lot of scrutiny about that, particularly because it's the official book of the film. So once it's in, it becomes law, as it were. So that was something that they didn't ask for. And I try to bring that to all these books, something extra, something that perhaps will surprise people when they look through it. But of course, for me, it was new. It was a new area because although it's my 8th book, it was very new. People were around. They kind of could speak to me. I was given lots of interviews that were done on set. I had to track people down myself who they hadn't interviewed. And then I was able to enhance what they gave me with new questions. But as you'll find with something like this, there are areas that you can't really ask about. So if you imagine your perfect dinner party with maybe Stanley Kubrick at one end of the table, Alfred Hitchcock and so on, and Charlie Chaplin, the questions you'd ask these wonderful people. You're not really in that position with all of these folks to ask them about other films and other projects. It's although that didn't stop me, because I am rather cheeky like that. And in the case of Sir Ridley Scott, my next book, which is now nearly finished, he had there was some connecting DNA, as it were, so I couldn't let the opportunity go without confirming a story regarding that. No, very different for me. And I must say, Jamie, since we last spoke, you've done your Return of the Jedi unofficial timeline as well. So you're in the book club, you're in the authors club.
Yeah. Yeah,
Congratulations.
we got it out there. It's still selling a few copies every month, so which is great. A couple of years on, I think now, nearly. But yeah, no, I'm always amazed when I see that you've got another book coming out. You seem to be able to do these at such a pace. But given the scale of this production and being brought on kind of early, what were the first steps you took in kind of shaping the book? Because you've got to think logistically, you've got to think editorially, you've got to think in terms of design. Where did you begin?
Well, I kind of thought about, why has it taken 25 years? Is there a story there? Yes. When they did start shooting, they stopped because of the various Hollywood strikes that there had been. How did that affect things? Can I talk about that? The financial impact of that. I'm always a kind of a stats person, how much did something cost? How much did something make? So I was able to have access to that information as well. So rather than it just being people talking in what's called an EPK, or an electronic press kit. And for people listening who don't know what that is, and I know you know, Jamie, it's where interviews are done on set, where everyone says they had a great time, and they're distributed amongst daytime television, where they can cut them up into their various programs, have interviews with the great and the good, but very much saying a similar sort of thing. I was quite keen myself that the book was more than that, and I certainly think it is. And I know Abrams wanted to do something that was quite sort of landmark and special as well, and that certainly came through in the design. It's massive. It's
a weapon.
I've got this thing behind me on an easel, but I've got one here, and I've got a massive fat head, and it's even bigger than that. And it's like, wow, and it's as thicker than an Argos catalogue from the 80s, and that's pretty good measure. So there was a lot of investment in terms of the book and in terms of the production of the book. So I think for me, they wanted something which was deliverable. And with previous books, I've always made sure I delivered on time and on budget. We've never missed either of those two things. And this had to hit beats. The film was coming out. We wanted to be in a position where we could talk about everything in the book. Because other recent making of books, I think on one of the Star Wars films, didn't reveal that, was it Palpatine was back on the third Star Wars movie, the J.J. Abrams one. What was that called? It was
The Rise of Skywalker. Yeah.
Rise of Skywalker, the third one, yeah. So I think in some of the making of books there, they didn't mention the Emperor was back. And we kind of thought, well, we want to make sure we can mention everything, please. And so we did. But it was interesting. I wasn't sort of sent the script in the traditional way or the photos in the traditional way. I had to watch them on a secure server and read things over and over. So when I wanted pull quotes from the actors, again, something I suggested, I had to read the script many, many times over. But the script itself was on a time limit. So I had to get the reading of it done, I think by was it 1st of June last year? So I had to make sure I memorised and copied out what I needed. So it was a very different way of working. And of course, like all these projects, people have a point of view. So the truth is kind of subjective to some extent. I mean, facts never are, but people's experiences, I had a great time, and someone else was, I had a terrible time. And they're on the same boat. So how do you differentiate those stories? But of course, I suppose the biggest change for me was it's a major, major studio picture, possibly the biggest film of last year. So if there were controversies, how do you get into them? How do you document them? Are you burning your own bridge by doing that? So it's kind of, it was a tricky balancing act. And of course, the book would go back to Abrams, who I was very pleased enjoyed what they read, then back to Paramount, back to Sir Ridley Scott's people. And so it would come back with notes, as you'd expect. But all of them were terribly constructive, and everyone liked what was happening. And it all moved at quite a pace. And I was enormously flattered to be asked, because they could have asked anyone. and they chose me, which was rather special. I was very pleased.
Yeah, I was pleased to see your name on it because you kindly sent me a copy of the book, and I thought I didn't order this, and I opened it up, and I was like, oh, it's John, brilliant, amazing. I mean, that's it is a big leap for you, and one that you've worked hard to reach, and I'm glad you have. But in a book like this, you want to, as you say, you want to document what went on at the time in the making of this movie whilst it's being made. So how do you go about kind of making sure that it isn't just a surface level art book with just pictures in it, that you've got the stories and the descriptions of what went on to back up that kind of process and intention for the movie?
Well, you've got the, if you like, the witness statements, so the people who were present and what they saw, which was what you can imagine. But then you have the background stories. So Denzel Washington, for example, the director he's most worked with in his career is Tony Scott, Sir Ridley Scott's brother. He's worked on him, I think it was on 13 or 14 films, it says in the book.
Really?
And so there's a whole section on Tony Scott and the films and the relationship between Tony and Ridley. And of course, Tony made his directorial debut with The Hunger, which is a marvellous vampire film. If people haven't seen that, it's Catherine Deneuve and David Bowie as well. And it's really a wonderful film. Considered as a sort of an art house film at the time. It's I think been reassessed in recent years. He went straight from that to do films like Top Gun and Beverly Hills Cop 2 and so on, and Days of Thunder. And he had a marvellous career and teamed with Denzel Washington. Of course, Ridley teamed with him on other films as well, like American Gangster. And so getting some of the background there and the sort of connective DNA between Tony, Ridley and Denzel is kind of fascinating. So I did that in all the departments. When you're speaking to the production designer, when I was speaking to the art directors, the directors of photography, they all had history with Ridley, and the visual effects as well. With a whole section in the book separating visual from special effects.
Yeah,
I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to all that stuff.
that made me
And
smile.
so
Yeah.
Mark Borowski down at Industrial Light and Magic, asking him about that. But always the shadow of the other film, always the shadow of Gladiator. And so often my questions would refer back to, well, did you try and do that? I've heard you try to do that on the first film. Why not? What happened? Why have we got it now in this film? So there were quite a few technical aspects of Gladiator 2 that were achieved this time round that couldn't be achieved originally. And that sort of thing fascinates me, what could have been and what should have been. And there is already now talk of a Gladiator 3, and there's a concept in mind for it. And I'm more than happy to go out to Morocco. I'll wear a massive hat. I'll have a tinfoil umbrella and factor 50. So I'm already prepping my emergency bag.
I think what you always manage to do in your books is, you have that technical description, within certain departments, within certain interviews that you've, people that you've spoken to, but they're always very accessible, your books. Did you find with this, given that you had such a plethora of information kind of thrown at you with all these images and all these interviews, that balance was difficult to find, or is that something that comes easy to you now?
I kind of knew going in it was going to be a different sort of creature, and that it was going to be so fresh in people's minds that people would verbatim have very similar points of view. So I tried to sort of pick and choose which ones I put in the final book, because you don't want everyone saying the same thing, all the witnesses giving the same testimony. So trying to find a voice for each aspect in each department was crucial. A lot of times that crossed over. So the way in which Arthur Max, the production designer, would create his sets, knowing how John Matheson paints with golden light, meant that there was lots of crossover there. So I was kind of interested in those areas where departments crossed over. I haven't been able to do that before on other books because there's been no one really around to ask. I couldn't ask people on The Wicker Man or The Third Man or Conan about camera loading and about were responsibilities shared in departments when people were sick and, what happened on emergency days. So there was the advantage of that. Luckily with the photos, the thousands and thousands of photos, Abrams and their team got on board. The design team there kind of looked at things much more closely. But what not to include is so difficult. How many pages is the book? I'll have to have a cheeky look. I can't remember. It's my longest book so far. It's 240 pages, which for a big hardback kind of coffee table book is quite out there. But even then, we could have done twice the size of a book. And there are aspects of the film that I didn't have access to at the time because the book had to go to print. So the kind of animated title sequence, all the poster variants, stuff with the music, the deleted scenes, what could have been in Gladiator 2 that wasn't, who was nearly cast and who wasn't. We could do a special edition book. So, I've said to Abrams if they want to go back again and revise and update and charge people rather cheekily for the book again with a little sash on the side saying new material added, then there are areas we could add to. That goes through all the books, I think. But I think here it was crucial to recognise what I did before, but take advantage of the fact that people are here now and we can ask them the details. I'd really like to ask people what they had for breakfast and what they had in the catering. There wasn't enough space in the book for all of that. But when you can ask that, why wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And, in this day and age where we've got, videos online almost immediately showing us behind the scenes stuff like the EPK stuff you're talking about and potentially documentaries on Blu-ray releases, where do you see the role of a physical book like this in today's film culture?
Well, I think a book like this has to sit alongside. So most of my books have had a release to some extent with Studio Canal, perhaps with The Third Man, The Wicker Man, Escape from New York and Flash Gordon. They all had, in the case of some of those, they had mini versions of my books in their 4K releases, which I was always a bit anxious about because I thought, well, if they've seen a little mini taster, they might not bother with the book. But it's very much a companion piece, so it's recognising that there might be some overlap. But really, I think the trick for these books is to find images the studios don't have and find things to say that are not in commentaries, that are not in DVD extras. Because I think if you just collated what's already been talked about and have nothing new to say and have no new way of presenting it, then people would think, I'll listen to the director's commentary and have a flick through the gallery on the Blu-ray set. That'll cover it. I don't need John Walsh's book, untidying my house. But we need to make sure that we have something new to say. So in the case of, say, The Wicker Man, we were trying to debunk a myth that had been gone around for 50 years. Much, I think, to the horror of some of the fans who held on to that myth. But it was nice to kind of straighten out the truth there. So I think with all these books, it's crucial to offer up good value and good penmanship and good photography, of course. But also, if you have something new to say, and it doesn't have to be new for the sake of it or controversial for the sake of it, but I think finding new information out, we did it on all of the books so far. And certainly on Gladiator 2, the images that were released to the press were not the ones that were in the book. A lot of that was held back for Abrams by Paramount and Scott Free because they wanted the book to have its own, as it were, presentation, own marquee potential. So people have said to me, saw the film, I read your book, I went back and watched the film again because actually it gave me a greater appreciation because the film goes by in quite a kind of a hectic hour and 2.5 hours. I saw it in IMAX when it was finally finished. And I was like, wow, that was incredible. But my book took me ages. Why did the film go so quickly? So you kind of need to slow down. The book, I think, slows you down into looking and examining more closely what happened. And, there are people who are bigger fans of maybe the first film than they are of the second. And actually some the other way around. If you've only seen Gladiator 2, remembering there's a 25-year gap between the two films. So people who are fans of maybe the Marvel universe, they might see this film, see young Paul Mescal, who was brilliant, and say, this is Gladiator for me. They've seen the original film and go, oh, okay, that's okay, prefer Gladiator 2. So it has been interesting how it's divided amongst age lines to some extent. And the same with, most films where there's there are people who prefer The Phantom Menace to the original Star Wars trilogy. Yeah. And, there's nothing to take away from The Phantom Menace, but, lots of people in their top tens wouldn't put it in necessarily their first or second place, but who knows?
Very much a generational thing, as you say.
Yes.
I guess with having all those 30,000 images or whatever it was, there was a temptation sometimes to show the sort of iterative nature of the framing and the effects layered on top and the production design and the set extension and all of that stuff, which to some aspect is in the book. But it must have been very difficult to kind of rein yourself in and not go to 1,000 pages, because a film like this is so visually lush. You kind of want to, give it as much credit as you possibly can in a book like this, and I think you have done that. But again, difficult to find that balance, I'm sure. And was there ever a version of this book where it was 350 pages and you had to kind of rein it in, or did you kind of were you always aware of that ceiling, and once you hit it, you were then adding and deleting from that stage?
I think we realised going in what the limitations would be. On my first standalone film book, Flash Gordon, I ended up writing nearly twice the size of the book that was asked for. And so it made a lot more work for everyone later down the line. So I was kind of fairly, I was wide-eyed but realistic about what was going to be achieved. But I did know that the brief that was coming back, there was never a specific brief, but the intentions that we got back from Sir Ridley Scott was that it needed to be a coffee table art book. So if we think of coffee table art books, if you're picking up a David Hockney book, for example, a selection of images would be chosen in their very best quality, as large as possible, to illustrate a certain period of his art. And so that's perhaps the way we took this. What were the very best images that most represent the construction of the Colosseum, or the production arts for the flooding with the shark sequence? But yeah, I'm like a kid in a toy shop. We could have done 2 books. We could have done double the size book. I'm even talking to you now about revisiting the book, opening it up and putting more things in. So it's recognizing from the brief what they need from me, and also the experience from the other books, making sure that, what I've learned I'm bringing with me, because they want that guy who did all those books to do something for them which is contemporary, but also with an eye to those books which have all sold sort of magnificently well.
I do like that you've given space for those images. There's nothing that winds me up more in this type of book where there's an image you really want to see up close and it's like a postage stamp. Luckily, of course, you had the benefit of this very recent archive that had been created, as opposed to digging into a historical archive where maybe image quality isn't so good. But I think there are sections in the book where you just linger for so long because there's just so much imagery kind of being thrown at you, but always backed up with your writing, which I enjoy. And it feels like in some ways it's part oral history, even though it's a recent oral history, but it's part design book. It's filling these two kind of different categories of book, but I think it does it really well. There's not a question there. That's just purely a statement to you, John.
No, thank you. I appreciate that, Jamie. Thank you.
Are you beginning to see yourself as a bit more of a visual historian now? Then, now that you've got you've had access to an archive of this size, and you've been working with the publisher to kind of whittle it down to the images that are the best choice for the book and the brief that you had. Is this something you'd love to go on to do further? Be more of a visual historian?
I guess. It's much like the documentary work I used to do for TV. You'd find the best clips that most illustrate something, or you'd recreate something to show the point in a way that's most effective. Or animation. I did animation on a homeless series, which was thought to be controversial at the time. It was rotoscoping, and it was a homeless series about children for the BBC. And I remember the BBC being very anxious about using animation with children in a series about children living in sheltered accommodation, because it might have seemed to be flippant and so on. But it was the best way to illustrate that in that series. And so film is a visual medium. When we think about how we doom scroll, as people call it, on our phones, we're looking instantly at images, and it is the image that will draw us to the post, and we might read them beneath it. So it is taking that on board, and I'm very aware that the image sells the page and therefore sells the book. So if it's unseen and it's your favourite film, you've never seen those shots before, that's going to do it for you. So a brief description, a respectful caption without saying the obvious, and learning to pare the text back so that it does say what it needs to, but without too much of my voice. And I learned on the early books that if I get that out of the way in the introduction, I can say what I think. That's done. So we don't need to hear from me again. Right, let's get on with the people who made this film and what went wrong or what went right and so on. So you can get your little confession out of the way in the intro and do your fanboy thing that you need to do if you're a fan of that film and so on. But I think the visuals here are key, because when these pages are put on Amazon, publishers will choose those pages which best sell the book. So it is definitely a visual medium in terms of these books and selling them. I'm looking at doing other things as well. There's a possibility of a novel on the horizon as well, which I'm kind of excited about. But really, a lot of this writing I've been doing for years for TV without being properly paid for it, because when you're pitching stuff and a commissioner needs to see a sort of an outline of 4 or 5 pages or 10 pages, you're busy typing it away, sending it in for pitch, and either the pitch happens or doesn't because of what you've written. But you don't get retrospectively paid for that if a green light comes on. You get commission. So I've kind of been doing it for a long time for free. So it's nice to do it, be recognised, be paid, and have it within hardback covers.
Yeah, it feels like you've got your feet in a lot of different camps here. You know, you're a documentary maker, like you said. You worked in animation and television, and we've got this visual feast of a book now. We've got your other books that are more kind of historical leaning. You're talking about a novel as well. I mean, you just don't seem to stop, John. You're very shark-like, just driving forward all times, thinking of the next step.
Thanks. Yeah, I see it as that.
Is there another project on the horizon for you that is in an area that you've not dipped your toe into?
Yes. So my next book, which is now mostly finished, is on the Texas Chain Saw Massacre. Oh, wow. So after doing a book on the biggest budget film ever in my series of books to the smallest budget film of the series of books that I've done. So Tobe Hooper's 1974 Texas Chain Saw Massacre will be coming out next year. I think it's already available to pre-order on Amazon and everywhere else, all the various bookshops. And that's been fascinating because Ridley showed a print of that film to the crew just before he started shooting Alien in 1979, to give them an idea of the claustrophobia, the person under attack, and the handheld cameras and what was achievable. Of course, Texas Chainsaw was shot on 16mm and has a kind of an absolutely hair-curlingly crazy backstory which I was super pleased I was able to actually get properly involved with and untangle, because the fans, I think, have been waiting for the story on that more than The Wicker Man. So that's kind of done and dusted. The manuscript, just waiting for final sign-off. I'm going to be working with the art department at Tyson Books and the layout artist for that. And that's going to be going off to print at the end of this year, out next. So it's kind of a big slasher horror film, and one that the Variety has called the best horror film of all time, controversially.
And was that something you pitched, or is that something that they came to you with the idea of?
They came to me. Tyson said to me, "Do you fancy doing this?" I said, "Yep, okay, we'll do that." So I think it's been a kind of an even split of what I've pitched and what's come to me. And sometimes, you're doing a book and they'll come to you and say, "What about this?" And you haven't had the headspace to think of a new book for yourself. And then this comes along and you think, "Oh, actually, yes, if it's no holds barred." And I did say this to the folks at the licensor who own Texas Chainsaw and to Titan Books. I said, can we go no holds barred? Because the real story of how this film was made is actually a real shocker. And they said, yep. I was like, you sure? They said yes.
So enough time has passed. Yeah.
Yeah. And I can briefly preview it with you and tell you what the shocking story is if you'd like to hear it.
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
So when the film was finished, so shocking was the content and the material. They didn't have a distributor in place. And normally when you're making a film, even in independent film, you'll have a distributor ready to do something with it, to strike a few prints, to get it in a few theatres and to get the ball rolling. So they took it round to all of the major studios, all of whom said no, most of whom wouldn't watch it because they knew what it was about. And so they did find one distributor called Bryanston, which sounds fairly innocuous. But Bryanston mostly distributed films in adult theatres, which meant pornography cinemas. And that's, if you like, the good news compared to what the bad news is. Bryanston was run by the proper real-life solid gold mafia.
Right. Wow.
So it became a real problem moving forward for people to get a share of the film. And in the book, we've tracked down the son of the owner of Bryanston, Chris Sefro, who runs Trick or Treat Studios now, who does fabulous masks and toys and games based on classic horror franchises. And we've really unravelled that whole story of what happened, how it happened, and what the ramifications are today of a film that was owned and run by the mafia. Who went to prison? All of that's in the book. The British Board of Film Censors here, we spoke to them about what happened, and everyone who survived spoke to me for it. So Kim Henkel, who co-wrote it with Toby Hooper and produced it. Terry McMinn, who's the girl who's hung up on the meat hook, spoke to her, and of course the guys who still are alive from the minibus. So that was quite something. To find enough images for that book in high resolution was kind of tricky, and luckily we came across a stash of amazing images that have never been published before. Surprise, surprise, my little mantra. So that's going to be one I think that will excite people. It's going to be launched at Comic-Con next year, so there's going to be a bit of an announcement to go with the book at Comic-Con. So that's going to be in July, and then the book's available at Comic-Con, but mostly in the shops from the 1st of September. Yes, it's going to be a busy sort of 2026, and I'm speaking to a third publisher now about another book. So I'm spreading my favours.
That sounds amazing. It's like ripe for a documentary as well, that you just pull on these threads and get deeper and deeper into the mysteries of that movie. That's fantastic. Well, listen, John, I always like talking to you. I always appreciate your time, and come back on the podcast anytime you like.
I'd love to come back for Texas Chain Saw and shock you all with what we found.
That was John Walsh talking about his latest book, The Art and Making of Gladiator 2, which is available now from Abrams Books. I'll leave a link in the show notes. You can also hear my previous conversations with John about Escape from New York and The Wicker Man in earlier episodes of this podcast. As always, if you enjoy these chats, please share the podcast and leave a rating or review, either on YouTube, leave a comment maybe, subscribe to the YouTube channel, or go on Apple Podcasts and leave a review. It really helps others find the show. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back soon with another full episode of the Filmumentaries Podcast.